Good afternoon. Let me start by telling you this. We are living through one of the most significant inflection points in modern history, a generational pivot none of us can ignore. Every time we study history, from the Dutch tulip mania to the Great Depression to the 2008 crisis, we see the same forces play out in recurring patterns: debt buildup, social fracture, geopolitical tension, and monetary breakdown. Today, these forces are converging. That's why what we're facing is not just another recession. It is a collapse that will change a generation. Throughout history, the pattern is unmistakably clear. There's a rhythm to how debt accumulates, how it feeds itself, and how it eventually becomes unsustainable. People and governments alike tend to borrow beyond their means during times of economic optimism, believing the good times will last forever. The illusion of perpetual growth drives excess. At first, the borrowing feels productive, funding investments, stimulating demand, and boosting asset prices. It all seems like progress, but underneath the surface, a dangerous imbalance grows. Debt in itself isn't inherently bad. In fact, when used responsibly, it can be a powerful tool for building wealth and driving innovation. The issue arises when the debt grows faster than income and productivity. When that happens over long periods, we reach a point where servicing the debt, paying interest and principal, starts to weigh heavily on income. This creates pressure. To keep up, more debt is issued, which pushes interest expenses higher and consumes a larger share of the economy's output. Eventually, it becomes clear that this cycle cannot continue forever. When debt is cheap, usually due to low interest rates, borrowers become complacent. They take on more leverage because it feels affordable, but this affordability is an illusion. As interest rates inevitably rise to combat inflation or tighten policy, the cost of that accumulated debt rises sharply. What was once manageable becomes crippling. Households struggle with mortgages, corporations with bonds, and governments with deficits. The entire system becomes more fragile, vulnerable to shocks. One of the most dangerous aspects of prolonged debt cycles is the feedback loop they create. When debt fuels spending, spending drives growth. That growth, in turn, encourages more borrowing. Asset prices inflate, housing, equities, commodities, and this creates a false sense of security. People see their net worth rising and feel richer, which prompts even more spending and borrowing. But these gains are not rooted in fundamentals. They're driven by leverage, and leverage works both ways. It amplifies upside, but it also magnifies risk on the downside. At some point, the debt servicing costs become too burdensome. Growth slows, credit conditions tighten, lenders become cautious, and borrowers begin to default. That's when deleveraging begins. But unlike the upward part of the cycle, which is fast and euphoric, deleveraging is slow and painful. It involves reducing spending, selling assets, and prioritizing debt repayment over investment. All of this puts downward pressure on the economy. Incomes decline, unemployment rises, and asset prices fall. The very things that once lifted the economy now drag it down. Policy responses are critical during these times. Central banks typically lower interest rates to stimulate borrowing and consumption. But when rates are already near zero, that tool loses effectiveness. Then comes quantitative easing, injecting liquidity by buying assets to prop up prices and encourage lending. While this can stabilize markets in the short term, it introduces new risks. It can distort price discovery, widen inequality by inflating financial assets, and further incentivize risk-taking. Eventually, governments may resort to fiscal stimulus, borrowing even more to fund programs, subsidies, or infrastructure to jumpstart demand. This adds to the public debt, which was already high going into the downturn. Over time, the system becomes increasingly reliant on artificial support. Markets no longer respond to fundamentals, but to central bank guidance and government intervention. Confidence becomes fragile. Trust in currency, institutions, and the broader economic order erodes. Throughout these stages, it's easy to lose sight of the structural problems that caused the debt buildup in the first place. We treat symptoms like unemployment or stagnation without addressing the root issue, the addiction to debt-fueled growth. Without structural reforms, raising productivity, reforming entitlements, improving education, creating incentives for real investment, the system simply reverts to the same cycle. Each iteration grows more dangerous because the capacity for future borrowing diminishes. This is not a theoretical exercise. History has shown this pattern time and time again. Whether in the Roman Empire, the Dutch Golden Age, the British cycle, or the American post-war expansion, the arc is always similar. A long period of debt accumulation, rising euphoria, peak leverage, and painful deleveraging. The specifics vary, but the core mechanics do not. The only question is whether we recognize the signals early enough to adapt, before the correction becomes unavoidable. In the end, the key isn't to eliminate debt, but to manage it wisely, to understand the constraints it imposes, to build systems that align spending with productivity, not short-term political or market desires. Those who do this can navigate the cycle with resilience. Those who ignore it risk being swept away when the tide turns. When you look across time and place, the moments when societies unravel from within tend to follow a common pattern. It starts slowly, almost imperceptibly, as small tensions accumulate beneath the surface. These are tensions between rich and poor, educated and uneducated, urban and rural, left and right, old and young. They often simmer quietly for years. But over time, they build momentum, feeding on political dysfunction, economic disparity, and social resentment, until eventually the internal divisions become too large to ignore. That's when the real danger begins, when the shared beliefs that hold a country together begin to erode. Societies function on trust, trust in institutions, trust in leadership, trust in the system being fair. When people believe they're playing on a level field, they're more likely to accept temporary losses or periods of difficulty. But when that belief disappears, when people start to feel the game is rigged, the social contract begins to break. One group starts blaming another, the center doesn't hold, extremes become louder. And moderate voices, which are essential for a functioning democracy, are drowned out by ideological rigidity. These are not isolated incidents. They are markers of internal decay. History shows that this kind of internal fragmentation tends to happen late in the cycle, often after a long period of prosperity. During the good times, people forget how fragile things can be. They take unity for granted. But when economic growth slows, when debt levels rise, inflation bites, and opportunity becomes unevenly distributed, people get anxious. They look for explanations, and usually they find someone else to blame. It becomes a zero-sum mindset. People no longer see themselves as part of a shared project. They retreat into identity, ideology, or resentment. At this stage, populism tends to emerge. On the right and the left, you begin to hear more rhetoric that demonizes the other side. Political leaders tap into frustration and amplify it rather than calming it. The system, which depends on compromise and shared facts, starts to break down. Disagreement turns into hostility. politics becomes warfare by other means. And that makes it almost impossible to deal with real problems, like debt, competitiveness, and education, because everything becomes a fight about identity or values. The nation becomes paralyzed. This kind of internal conflict is dangerous not just because of the social unrest it creates, but because it weakens a country's ability to respond to external challenges. When you're fighting among yourselves, it's very hard to compete globally. Rival nations sense the weakness and exploit it. Allies become uncertain. Adversaries become emboldened. You start to lose influence in the world, not necessarily because your resources have declined, but because your internal divisions prevent effective action. It's like a company whose board of directors is at war. It doesn't matter how much capital it has if it can't make decisions. Social cohesion is also essential for navigating economic downturns. When people trust each other, they can pull together in hard times. But when divisions are high, every policy response becomes controversial. You can't raise taxes because half the population sees it as theft. You can't cut spending because the other half sees it as cruelty. You can't even agree on basic data, like whether inflation is good or bad, because facts themselves become politicized. This leads to paralysis, and the problems keep growing. In these environments, more people become disillusioned. They disengage from politics, they stop voting, or they support fringe movements that promise to tear everything down. Civil discourse breaks down. In some cases, violence becomes normalized, first in rhetoric, then in action. Once that line is crossed, it's very hard to go back. It's not just a crisis of policy, it's a crisis of legitimacy. People stop believing that the system can work at all. That's the final stage before collapse. But decline isn't inevitable. Societies that recognize these warning signs early can still course correct. It requires strong leadership, shared sacrifice, and a return to common purpose. That's hard to do in a divided environment, but it's not impossible. It starts by restoring trust, by showing that institutions work for everyone, not just the powerful. It means acknowledging real grievances without weaponizing them, and it requires reminding people that what unites them is still greater than what divides them. Cycles like this don't correct on their own. They require intentional effort. Otherwise, the divisions widen, the institutions weaken, and the social fabric tears apart. And when that happens, it's not just the economy that suffers, it's the whole society. The key is not to wait until it's too late. Recognize the cycle, understand the signs, and act before the collapse becomes irreversible. Throughout history, the rise and fall of empires have been shaped not just by what happens within borders, but also by the dynamics between powers. When global systems shift, they do so gradually, then suddenly. What we're witnessing now is a reordering of the world, not through a single event, but through a long, strategic, and accelerating process of separation. The old model of globalization, based on mutual benefit, open markets, and economic integration, is fraying. Trust, which once underpinned global trade and capital flows, is breaking down, and when trust disappears between nations, they stop cooperating and start decoupling. This isn't just about tariffs or trade wars. It's deeper. It's a comprehensive strategic divergence between major powers, primarily between the West and China, with Russia playing a destabilizing role. It's playing out across multiple domains: supply chains, financial systems, military alliances, technology standards, energy markets, and even currency reserves. The world is no longer moving toward integration. It's pulling apart into competing blocks. And each side is trying to insulate itself from the other in order to gain leverage and minimize vulnerability. That's what geopolitical decoupling looks like in practice. Economically, the signs are everywhere. Major countries are reshoring or friend-shoring their manufacturing capacity, not because it's cheaper, but because it's safer. Security of supply has become more important than efficiency. Whether it's semiconductors, rare earths, pharmaceuticals, or critical minerals, the new imperative is control. Relying on a strategic competitor for key inputs is no longer considered acceptable. As a result, companies and governments are redirecting capital away from globally optimized production toward redundant, secure systems. That means higher costs and less interdependence, but also more resilience. Technology is another key front. The competition over who controls the infrastructure of the future AI, 5G, quantum computing, space systems, is intensifying. Nations are no longer just trying to innovate faster. They're trying to keep their rivals from accessing critical breakthroughs. Export controls, investment restrictions, sanctions, and regulatory bifurcation are becoming standard tools. And it's not just about hardware, it's about entire ecosystems. Competing standards, software platforms, and cybersecurity regimes are fragmenting the digital landscape. The more the world divides along these lines, the harder it becomes to coordinate even basic cooperation. Finance is undergoing a similar realignment. For decades, the U.S. dollar has been the foundation of the global financial system. But the use of sanctions, while effective in the short term, has accelerated efforts among other nations to develop alternatives. Countries are beginning to settle trades in local currencies, build alternative payment systems, and diversify their reserve holdings. This doesn't mean the dollar will collapse. It still holds enormous structural advantages. But the trend is clear. The world is seeking to reduce dependence on any single player. That's a fundamental shift in the global order. Energy and resource security is also becoming a dividing line. The recent turmoil in global oil and gas markets has reminded nations that energy independence isn't just an economic issue, it's a geopolitical one. The rush toward renewables is partially about climate, but it's also about reducing vulnerability. At the same time, traditional resource exporters are seeking to use their position as leverage. Access to energy, food, and water is increasingly being seen as a strategic asset, not just a commodity. And as climate volatility increases, the competition for these essentials will only intensify. The military dimension cannot be ignored. As strategic tensions rise, countries are investing heavily in defense, not just to deter conflict, but to assert influence. Naval buildups in key maritime choke points, cyber operations targeting critical infrastructure, and territorial posturing in contested zones are becoming more frequent. These moves are not isolated. They are deliberate steps in a broader decoupling strategy. Each side wants to shape the rules, set the boundaries, and define the terms of engagement. And when diplomacy is weak, miscalculation becomes more likely. What makes this moment especially consequential is that it's unfolding alongside economic fragility, rising debt burdens, and internal divisions within nations themselves. The more fragmented the internal dynamics, the more reactive nations become externally. Leaders under pressure at home often adopt more aggressive postures abroad. This dynamic adds fuel to the fire. Trust erodes faster, cooperation becomes harder, and the likelihood of conflict direct or proxy increases. This type of decoupling doesn't happen often in history, but when it does, it tends to precede major shifts in global power. It's a sign of an old order breaking down and a new one struggling to be born. It's not necessarily a descent into chaos. It could lead to new alignments and systems, but it is inherently destabilizing. Navigating this environment requires understanding how the pieces are moving and, more importantly, why. Because if you're not paying attention, you'll be caught off guard when the separation becomes irreversible. Monetary systems are built on belief in stability, in value, in the idea that the currency you're holding today will retain its purchasing power tomorrow. When that belief starts to weaken, systems that once felt unshakable begin to show cracks. The unraveling rarely happens all at once. It starts subtly through erosion of fundamentals, mismanagement of fiscal and monetary policies, and the gradual buildup of pressures that eventually become too large to control. And when those pressures are released, the effects are systemic, not just economic. Every monetary order in history has followed a cycle. There is the rise. When a country establishes dominance through productivity, competitiveness, and innovation, that strength creates trust in its currency. The currency becomes widely used for trade and reserves. It provides the issuer with extraordinary power. It can borrow cheaply, export inflation, and impose sanctions. But over time, that power is often misused. The country begins to live beyond its means, consuming more than it produces, borrowing excessively, and assuming that the advantages it holds are permanent. That's when the decline begins. The current global system, centered around the U.S. dollar, has been in place since the end of World War II. For decades, it's functioned as the bedrock of international trade and finance. Most commodities are priced in dollars. Most global reserves are held in dollars. Most international debt is denominated in dollars. This network effect has created a tremendous source of strength, but it's also bred complacency. The assumption has long been that no alternative exists, so the system can sustain any level of strain. That assumption is now being tested. What's eroding the foundation isn't a single event, it's a convergence of trends. High and persistent fiscal deficits, growing debt-to-GDP ratios, monetization of government debt, and reliance on ultra-loose monetary policies have begun to undermine confidence. When central banks expand their balance sheets rapidly to absorb government bonds, it creates liquidity in the short term, but raises doubts about discipline in the long term. That liquidity can fuel asset bubbles and widen inequality, but more importantly, it creates the perception that the system is no longer anchored by fundamentals. As inflation rises, policymakers face a dilemma. If they raise rates to combat inflation, it increases debt, servicing costs, and slows growth. If they keep rates low, it risks further inflation and currency debasement. Either way, confidence is strained. And confidence is everything in a fiat monetary system. The moment people begin to believe that their currency will buy significantly less in the future, they start moving their capital elsewhere to hard assets, foreign currencies, or alternative stores of value. That's how devaluation spirals begin, not just from bad policy, but from the loss of belief. Globally, the response to these dynamics is a quiet but accelerating movement away from dependence on a single currency. Countries are entering bilateral agreements to settle trade in local currencies. They're increasing their holdings of gold. They're investing in digital currencies and exploring new mechanisms for cross-border settlement. None of this will replace the dollar immediately, but it signals something deeper, a loss of trust in the long-term reliability of the existing system. When trust erodes, alternatives become more attractive, even if they're less efficient or untested. Sanctions and geopolitical tensions have added another layer of risk. When access to the global dollar-based system is weaponized, it creates a strong incentive for others to build parallel structures. This isn't a short-term move, it's strategic. It's about ensuring autonomy, reducing vulnerability, and avoiding exposure to political leverage. Over time, this shift reshapes the flows of capital, trade, and influence. The dollar remains dominant, but its uncontested supremacy is no longer guaranteed. The unraveling of a monetary order doesn't mean immediate collapse. It means transition. It means volatility. It means rising uncertainty about what comes next. The danger lies in assuming that the past will continue to define the future. Every system has limits. When those limits are reached, adjustments are made, either by design or by force. Historically, these transitions are accompanied by economic pain, political realignments, and social unrest. But they are also moments of opportunity, chances to reset, to rethink, and to build more sustainable foundations. The key is to stay alert to the signals, watch the flows of capital, watch the policy responses, watch the behavior of global actors. The monetary order is not unraveling overnight, but it is unraveling. The sooner we recognize that, the better prepared we'll be to adapt, not just to survive the transition, but to shape what comes after it. Because in every ending lies the blueprint of the next beginning. Risk and opportunity are always present, inseparable, like two sides of the same coin. Throughout history, the individuals, businesses, and nations that have succeeded over the long term have understood how to navigate both. The most dangerous thing is to look at the world through a one-sided lens, either seeing only the risks and becoming paralyzed, or seeing only the opportunities and becoming reckless. The key is balance, understanding the forces at play, assessing probabilities rather than certainties, and allocating resources in a way that preserves stability while still capturing upside. The first step in managing risk is recognizing that most people and systems tend to underestimate it, especially in good times. When markets are rising, credit is flowing, and volatility is low, it creates an illusion of safety. That illusion leads to overconfidence, excessive leverage, and poor decision making. The seeds of downturns are almost always planted in the upturns. If you don't account for that, you leave yourself exposed. One of the most important principles is to be prepared for things to go wrong, even if you hope they don't. That means building in buffers, diversifying exposures, and avoiding dependency on a single outcome. On the other hand, it's equally dangerous to be overly risk-averse. Opportunity doesn't come without uncertainty. Sitting on the sidelines or hoarding cash out of fear can be just as damaging as taking too much risk. The cost of missed opportunity compounds over time. Real returns are often driven by being early and having the courage to invest when others are fearful, provided you're doing so with discipline and insight. It's not about being right all the time. It's about having enough right decisions with enough downside protection that your losses are survivable and your gains are meaningful. Diversification is the most reliable tool for balancing risk and opportunity, not just across asset classes, but across countries, currencies, and economic environments. Different assets behave differently under various conditions. Some thrive in inflation, others in deflation, some in growth, others in contraction. When you build a portfolio or strategy that doesn't rely on any one set of conditions to succeed, You improve your chances of stability and performance across cycles. That doesn't mean you won't face losses. It means the losses are manageable and the path forward is less volatile. Understanding the broader context is critical. We're in a time of rising macro volatility. Debt levels are high. Geopolitical tensions are escalating. Technology is disrupting industries at an unprecedented pace, and the world is undergoing a shift in power dynamics. That environment creates risk in all directions, but it also creates opportunity. Times of disorder often lead to major revaluations of assets, of institutions, of leadership. Those who understand the structural forces, who study history, who analyze data, who avoid emotional decision-making, are in the best position to benefit from those shifts. The mistake many people make is assuming they can forecast the future with precision. That's rarely possible. The better approach is to build a system that can adapt. Instead of betting everything on a single view, prepare for a range of outcomes. Ask yourself, what if I'm wrong? What if the opposite happens? What could I lose and can I handle that? At the same time, ask, where is the asymmetry? Where can a small risk produce a large return? Where is the consensus wrong? This mindset creates resilience. It doesn't eliminate risk, but it makes it absorbable. In business, the same logic applies. Companies that manage their balance sheets conservatively during booms are often the ones able to expand aggressively during busts. They keep their powder dry when others are spending freely. They invest in long-term capabilities rather than chasing short-term growth, and when disruptions hit, whether from markets, technology, or regulation, they're able to pivot faster because they weren't overextended. That kind of positioning doesn't just happen. It's the result of discipline, humility, and a commitment to long-term thinking. On a personal level, balancing risk and opportunity means making decisions that align with your values, goals, and time horizon. It means not overreacting to headlines, not chasing what's popular, and not ignoring inconvenient truths. It means being willing to change your mind when the data changes. It means understanding that success is not about avoiding all risks, but about choosing the right ones and preparing for when they don't go your way. The world will always be uncertain. Cycles will continue. Shocks will come, but within that uncertainty is a constant stream of opportunity. Those who remain thoughtful, diversified, and disciplined, those who build systems that can survive storms and capture breakthroughs, are the ones who thrive. It's not about predicting the next move. It's about being ready whatever happens. That's how you achieve lasting success in an uncertain world. So let me leave you with this. This collapse is real, but it is not inevitable. Cycles can be broken. Systems can be reformed. I believe in human ingenuity and the power of smart, cooperative leadership. Those who understand the forces, prepare responsibly, and act decisively will not only survive, they will shape the next era. We can navigate this generational shift not as victims, but as architects of a better future. Thank you.